Hi everybody and welcome to today's webinar event during which our guest presenter is leading buyer's agent and best-selling author Miriam Sandkuhler based in Melbourne. We're going to be talking about opportunities and tips for success for certain types of buyers at the moment against the landscape of changes in our major markets. Primarily, I think Miriam's presentation will be focused on first-time buyers, but there'll also be content for rentvestors, upgraders, buyers of all types, really. But it's all against the background in which markets in our major cities like Sydney and Melbourne are changing. But what we believe at Hotspotting is that in any landscape, in any market environment, there are opportunities if you know what to look for and where to look for it. So I suggest that you stay tuned right to the end of today's presentation because Miriam will have a special offer for those who might be keen to take up the services she offers as a consultant and a buyer's agent. So Miriam Sandkuhler, welcome. How are you and what do you have for us today?
Hi Terry, thank you very much for having me. Yeah, so we're definitely going to have a look at what's going on in the market at the moment that's particularly having a substantial impact on first home buyers, and really going to talk about some action steps that they really should take fairly urgently and some tips to help them actually generate and secure an outcome.
Okay. I think it's true to say that the landscape has changed a lot, not only in terms of what's happening with markets, whether they're rising, falling, but also in the lending landscape as a very key component of what you want to talk about today.
Absolutely. So if we want to get started, I'll just get the ball rolling. First and foremost, just want to reiterate that during the presentation we're not providing any tailored financial, tax, legal or property advice, and we certainly strongly recommend that you seek independent accounting, legal, finance and property advice as well from an expert before embarking on actioning any information that we disclose or go through today. And by attending the presentation, obviously you agree to release, indemnify and hold harmless all presenters, their agents, representatives and employees for any loss or damage you may suffer in any way associated with your attendance at the presentation and or as a result of not seeking independent financial, tax or finance advice. So what we're going to cover today is I'm just going to give you a bit of a snapshot of the property buyer's journey, some of the challenges that people typically have when they're buying and what they come up against. We're going to talk about how the market's been changing, what buyer sentiment's like, particularly within the Melbourne metro market and the regional markets of Ballarat and Geelong. What are the implications to you as a first home buyer, an upgrader or even a rentvestor? What are the next steps and what are some tips for success that you can action? So in terms of who we are and what we do, well, we're an integrated property advisory firm and we have expertise in what we call buyer and vendor advocacy and doing property portfolio reviews. So we work with home buyers, sellers and investors. We buy high-performing investment-grade properties and they can either be an investment property or a home. Obviously, your home is your greatest asset, so you want to make sure it's investment-grade. And then we help people find the right property for their budget and we help people sell their properties when they're ready as well. So in terms of my qualifications, I'm a licensed estate agent working as a buyer's advocate, so representing the buyer independently throughout any transaction. I'm an accredited property investment advisor, a best-selling author, a media commentator, and as you can see, I've been finalist for a number of awards as well. So let's talk about some challenges that home buyers and investors actually have, particularly if you're a rentvestor out there. And a rentvestor is someone who ideally would like to buy their own home, but through circumstances or budget or simply wanting to live in a different area to where they're able to buy, they choose to invest instead and build up a portfolio that way. So one thing you need to be careful of if you are an investor is just being susceptible to property spruikers and developers and people out there talking about putting money into super, and they kind of offer a one-stop shop scenario. Generally it means a lot of the time they're not independent and you're not getting unbiased advice, so you really need to be wary about that. Certainly a lot of home buyers and investors are susceptible to buying compromised or poor performing assets, and that's because not all properties are the same. You know, the property type, the location, the suburb, the part of the suburb, they will all perform differently. And when you're looking at property, you're not comparing an apple with an apple with an apple. You're often looking at, you know, an orange, a banana and a mango, and how do you actually distinguish the difference between the two? So that's where it's very easy to come unstuck and where people often have challenges. Certainly there are time poor business owners and professionals that don't get the time to go out there and find the property they need to, whether it's their own home or whether it's an investment property. A lot of mum and dad investors think all properties are the same, and that's because for decades we've had the real estate industry educating consumers on how to buy the property that they want to sell them. So again, those myths have been put into the marketplace that unfortunately buyers think are true. You know, not all property doubles every 7 years. Not all property is a good investment. Not all property investment strategies are good for the individual. So it's about being really aware of all of that. Obviously, if you're information anxious and you're feeling overloaded by lots of conflicting advice in the marketplace, it can be overwhelming. And people can actually not take action as a result of that emotional overwhelm. And a lot of the time it's like buyers just don't know where to start. You know, what do you buy? Where do you start? Where do you buy it? And that's an enormous amount of decision making and consideration that goes into that process. People can still be misled by underquoting. You know, it's a little bit better now than it was a few years ago, but it's still a complicated process. Knowing and understanding how to appraise property is highly complex, and it's very easy to fall into the trap of falling for underquoting if you don't know how to do that. And again, just be aware in the marketplace, particularly if you're investors and you're seeking advice. A lot of people don't understand the difference between free property investment advice and sales advice, and more often than not, they're one and the same. So any property advisor worth their salt is usually independent, and they will charge a fee for service for what they do. And if it's free, just be aware of the fact that you're likely dealing with a selling agent or someone calling themselves a buyer's advocate who really isn't, and they're likely going to be paid by a third party, generally a vendor or a developer, and therefore they're not providing you with independent or unbiased advice. And then finally, again, whether you're an investor, an upsizer or a first home buyer, one of the biggest things that will determine whether or not you actually end up purchasing is a lot of people don't know how to value or price a property, and therefore they keep missing out. Now, in reality, there are 3 different prices. There's usually the price you want to pay, then the price that the property's worth, and then the price that you need to pay under competition. And there are variances within those, but if you don't understand that you have to consider those 3 prices, often can mean you keep missing out and you keep missing out and you keep missing out. And that's a really big problem. So just be aware that I'll talk about that a little bit further on, but that's where most people come unstuck. So if we talk about what's going on in the market at the moment and buyer sentiment, well, certainly APRA has come in with a whole lot of regulations around lending, and there's been a reduction of the number of investors in the marketplace. So primarily interest rates are higher for investors, deposit sizes are larger for investors than home buyers. So it's a really good opportunity for home buyers to be buying in the marketplace now because the conditions are better than they have been over recent years. And as a consequence, we're seeing an increase in more activity amongst first home buyers, but we're also seeing downsizes in the market, and they're quite strong and active, and I'll talk about that a little bit further. Now, buyers are more selective. Again, there's not as much competition, so there's a little bit of breathing room around that. We've noticed apartments are flat in terms of the sales activity around those, or the buying activity rather, and new and off-the-plan apartments are really struggling, again, because most investors have left the marketplace for that type of product. Certainly a lot of auctions I'm attending, often if it's an A-grade property, we're now only seeing maybe 2 bidders bidding, whereas 6 or 8 months ago, or certainly last year, we were seeing maybe 5 or 6 bidders. On a rare occasion, if it's still a property that's in high demand or low supply, or we've got downsizers involved in the bidding and competing against first home buyers, it's still possible to see 5 or 6 bidders on a property, even if it might be a B grade. But certainly B and C grade properties are passing in, that's more common, and a lot of properties being sold after it's passed in at auction. We're seeing yield-based investments getting brighter as prices sort of stop escalating, and yields are starting to improve as a result. So regional markets are starting to perform really well, or continuing to perform really well, in particular the likes of in Melbourne, in Victoria rather, Geelong and Ballarat, and Bendigo is starting to get a little bit more active as well. And one thing we're seeing is that migration levels and population forecasts are actually still very strong, and this goes to supply and demand considerations, which have enormous impact on the market. So let's talk about what's happening in the lending market. So it's actually tougher to qualify for home and investment loans. There are more hoops to have to jump through, and more bits of paper and more documentation and evidence that you have to provide lenders than ever before, and particularly more recently in the last 5 years. Bank policies regarding their lending policies are changing daily, and a lot of this has come about as a result of the Banking Royal Commission. So lenders are on high alert. They've gone from predatory lending a number of years ago, where they would give people money that probably didn't really genuinely qualify for it, and they would give them too much, and now they're starting to do the other extreme and go the other way. So that in some instances it's almost like, or it may feel like, lenders are doing everything they possibly can to not get your business on board, because they're just making it so tough for you to qualify. And also the other consideration is there's $60 billion worth of interest-only lending or loans that are due to convert to principal and interest over the next 2 to 3 years. Now, what this means, if you're currently an investor in the market and you've got that sort of loan coming to the fore, you really want to start looking at maybe seeing if you can refinance it sooner rather than later, and if you qualify for another interest-only loan, if there's potential to do that, or if you're going to actually be able to cash flow your loan once it converts to P&I. And this is particularly important if you've got multiple loans. So all of this is having an impact on how the banks and lenders are behaving when it comes to providing loan approvals in the marketplace currently. So from a supply and demand point of view, if we look at Sydney and Melbourne, now this came from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, we can see here that Victoria, if we have a look at the activity of housing supply versus demand, we can see that there's still demand in Victoria, and it's over and above what supply is currently meeting. But we can also see that that's a different case in New South Wales, which is also reflected by the fact that things are slowing down in the market in New South Wales, and it's been happening for quite a few months now, and in advance of what's been happening in Victoria. Having said that, though, if we look at what's going on from an immigration point of view, and we had a look at what happened during the 2018 year, the total migration program actually had 186,000 people migrate to Australia, which is a substantial amount of people. And so, again, while there's talk of creating immigration policies and looking at that because it's starting to affect the quality of lifestyle in our major cities, and particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, there's no feedback from the government that they're going to drastically reduce that. And so whilst those numbers are still strong, it's still having an effect in terms of different markets and different parts of different markets, and creating certainly a lot of demand, which can be a bit of a challenge depending on the levels of supply in the areas in which people are looking at buying. So let's talk about downsizers. I call them cashed up baby boomers. Generally, they're people over the age of sort of 55, 56. A lot of them have got a lot of equity in their homes. They've got family homes that they've held on to for decades, and they've brought up their children there. And then all of a sudden they find themselves with a 3 or a 4 bedroom house with a really big yard that takes a lot of maintenance, and it takes a lot of time to look after every weekend and time to clean. And they just don't need those homes anymore, and they don't want to be maintaining them. So there's a real move in the marketplace now, and particularly for people over the age, over the age of 65, there's been government incentives that have also come in that have basically stipulated that if you're over 65, if you've held your property for more than 10 years and you want to sell it, you have the ability to tip $300,000 into superannuation. So the idea of that is to provide those older people with a pension or an income of sorts into retirement, but also to free up properties for upsizers and upgraders to move into. And then those upgraders will hopefully free up properties for first home buyers to get in. However, we have top-down pressure. Once those people sell their properties, they are cashed up, they're not borrowing money, and they're frequently competing in that price point under $1 million. So you've got your first home buyers, you know, up to that 750 mark, and then you've got your downsizers coming in and often competing with them too. And a lot of the time they're going to want to have a CBD or an inner city property, and then they might have a sea change or a tree change property on top of it. So they might sell their bigger home in an inner suburban area in a major city and then take that money and split it across 2 properties. And unfortunately, this is where it's causing some grief for first home buyers. The difference obviously with first home buyers and rentvestors, most of you are borrowing money to buy. And obviously there's competition from that bottom price point up to the 750 mark. And it makes it really difficult to secure an outcome when you're competing with people that are cashed up. And they don't have to worry about whether or not they overpay for a property, because they're looking at potentially being in it for the next 10, 20, even 30 years. So it's a real challenge for you in the marketplace at the moment. So what are the implications? Well, let's talk about lending. What I'm saying to people is, don't assume that you're going to qualify for a loan. I know people go on to lender websites and bank websites and they do mortgage calculators and they have these figures that pop up and they just automatically make an assumption that it's going to be easy to qualify for money, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be the case. So lending is going to get harder and potentially harder progressively as time moves on. So if someone's thinking of waiting just for the sake of it, that might not be a smart idea. Particularly if you think that the market might drop. Well, potentially it could, but by the time that it does, you may no longer be in a position where you qualify for a loan. So there's a risk in thinking like that. So definitely lending is tight now and potentially could get even tighter down the track. Certainly from a supply and demand point of view, there's no sign of that slowing down. You know, again, Melbourne and Sydney are the 2 largest cities that have had the majority of people immigrate into those areas, and the government is starting to talk about making it compulsory for people to emigrate into Australia but then start in a regional area and work in a regional area before they actually are able to move to a city. So that's on the cards and being discussed, but it's not yet a requirement. Certainly downsizers, as I said before, versus first home buyers and rent investors, there's that price squeeze, particularly in that $500 million mark. And what that means for first home buyers and even rent investors, because you're still playing in that price point, is you need to start being flexible around your criteria and your expectations. You know, it may simply be that you're going to have to move further out or change the property type that you want to buy if you want to stay in a particular suburb. So you might need to revise your buying brief and your buying criteria, and even your buying strategy, and I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. So all I can say for first home buyers and rent investors where you might be really restricted to a tight budget is just become more flexible and don't get so fixated on your property has to have all of this stuff or you're not going to buy, because you may actually find that you won't be buying. The other thing too, when I work with home buyers, I talk about, you know, being prepared to not have the perfect property. And it may be that you've got a wish list of 100 things, but you might only achieve 80 or 85 of those things. The main thing is about buying a property where you have the capacity to live with things that are missing or update them or do something in time to compensate, because the priority is about getting into the property and into the market at this price point while you qualify for the loan, rather than miss out altogether. And again, with all those interest-only loan conversions, well, that could mean that there'll be more stock coming into the market, but there's no guarantee of what that stock might be. It could be apartments that people can no longer hold, and they might be in high-rise apartment buildings that may not be a good investment. They could be house and land packages. They could be older-style flats as well, or villa units. So while there's potential for more stock to come into the market in the next year or two, there's no guarantee as to what stock that will be, and there's no guarantee that if you wait, that you'll qualify for a loan at that point in time. So, well, what are the next steps? Well, if you're looking in the market to buy your own home at the moment and you don't have a formal finance approval in place, then I would encourage you to urgently and immediately contact your broker or your lender and to apply for finance. Now, even if you haven't bought a property yet, don't wait until you've got a property where you want to put an offer on it. Actually seek pre-approval, because that will give you some certainty, not a guarantee, but it'll give you some certainty around exactly how much money you've got to spend. And you'll go through that application process, which in reality for some people can take weeks to get an outcome. Certainly the bigger lenders, they're taking 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks to get back to people with pre-approval. And that's often because they might want to come back and continually get more and more information from you. Some of the smaller lenders are able to turn around approvals much more quickly, but there's a risk associated if you buy in the market and you don't have finance approval in place. So because it's so tough, I'd encourage you to get the ball rolling on that straight away. And at the same time, you can start your research. So start looking at the suburbs you want to buy in, start looking at the criteria, the type of property that you want, start taking into consideration, how long are you going to be buying that property or holding that property for? Is this your first home and is it going to be a family home? Do you need to be near schools and amenity and shops? Is it a stepping stone to your next family home? Is it more of a lifestyle property to begin with and then you'll look at the family home later? So start really nutting all of that out and just getting an idea of what that looks like and what those suburbs look like and what those price points might look like as well. And then once your loan has been approved, start the whole searching and buying process. So that's when you are getting onto, your realestate.com and your websites and you're having a look at the stock in the marketplace, and start doing all your open homes and keeping an eye on what's going on. Attend auctions, see what properties are selling for, see if they're passing in as best as possible. Try and ascertain what the value of the property is that's on your wish list that you'd like to buy or aspire to buy, and just keep an eye on what's going in the market and get involved and get active and get out there and have a look. Now, certainly what you always need to do is mitigate risk in the buying process. So you need to, very early on in the piece, engage a conveyancer or a solicitor so they can review your contract before you put any kind of offer on, particularly at auction. You don't want to be buying a property at auction and then throwing the contract in front of a solicitor 3 days later and asking them to check it then, because it's too late and they can't do anything about it if there's a problem. So before buying, always have your contract reviewed, and your conveyancer or solicitor will actually help you with the settlement process as well. And again, before you buy a property, it's really important that you source and use a really good building and pest inspector, principally because depending on the age of the property, brand new properties can have defects and faults. There's no guarantee that just because it's new, it doesn't have building issues. So you can specifically request a builder to do a defects report if it's an off-the-plan property that's been finished and you're due to make the final payment on it. You want someone to come in then and give you a report so that you know what the builder has to rectify before you pay that final amount of money. And also, again, if it's relatively new, depending on the condition or how well it was built in the first place, it still can have issues with it. So it could be a 2 or 3 year property, 3-year-old property and have problems, or it could be a 50-year-old property and have problems. And the reason why it's important to spend that $500 or $600, whatever the cost may be, to do that inspection is that every time I buy a property for a client, we always go through that process. Usually there's a minimum of $500 worth of stuff or $1,000 worth of little maintenance items to address, but sometimes there's been $20,000 or $40,000 or $50,000 worth of problems, and often in that instance it means we just simply won't buy the property, or my client will take that into consideration if for personal reasons they want to proceed. So it's imperative that you know what you're buying. This is going to be the most expensive item you'll probably ever buy in your life. And for the sake of a few $100s, you want to do everything you possibly can to protect yourself in that buying process to make sure you're not buying a property with a whole lot of problems. And it happens. I see it all the time. It happens all the time. So some tips for success. Well, firstly, don't procrastinate or overanalyze, hoping that the market will improve or drop or crash. There is no crystal ball to say what's going to happen. And I often talk to investors or first home buyers who want to wait and see what happens in the market because they might be able to pick up a bargain. And look, they might, but they also might have to pay a lot more for it depending on what happens over time and depending on where things are at in the market cycle. The other thing is that's often based on the assumption that they'll qualify for finance when they're ready to buy, and that's not necessarily the case. And I've seen a lot of people devastated by the fact that they've missed or given up their opportunity to buy a property, and they didn't when they could have, and now that they've finally decided they're ready, they might not qualify to borrow the same amount of money, or they may not qualify at all, and then all of a sudden their plans have gone down the drain. So just be really careful around that. You know, the over-analysis paralysis and the grass is always greener, and, you know, the assumption that something better will come along is usually also just a reason to not commit. You know, some people are a little bit avoidant when it comes to committing, and that's a good way of justifying it. But yeah, it can totally ruin your goals and your outcomes and desires if you don't actually take action when the lenders will give you money. And the other thing, you know, loan approval is king. Don't assume that just because you've got loan approval that you'll automatically be extended if it expires. So treat it with a little bit of urgency as well. You know, if you've got a loan approval that's valid for 90 days, take it seriously and do what you can to buy the right property in the right location for the right price, because it may be that after that 90-day period, if the lenders have changed their policy again, same thing, you might find that you don't qualify for the same amount. I knew of a buyer who had gotten a pre-approval for a property. He was given a $4 million pre-approval. On the back of that, he actually sold his own home, and then he put in an offer on a property to purchase something valued at $3 million. And in that time frame, and I think it was over several months, but in that time frame, the bank changed their policy and they didn't actually approve the $3 million purchase, in spite of him having had $4 million pre-approval. So again, don't assume you'll automatically get what you want when you want, and don't assume that time's necessarily on your side, and that you can take your time and see what's going to happen down the track. So develop a clear buying criteria. Well, I mentioned that before. Consider your must-haves, your non-negotiables, where you're prepared to be flexible with your property. Now, obviously, if you're a first home buyer or you're upsizing, that's very different to being a rent vestor. A rent vestor, you'll still have criteria, but it'll be more analytical and more based around returns and criteria that the property must have to have within its own right to be investment grade as well. So just understand there's a difference between the two. Obviously, you're a home buyer, there's an emotional component there, and you need to meet those emotional needs. But you also want to make sure you're buying a good property, it's not compromised, and it will serve you for a reasonable period of time, because it's really costly getting in and out of property all the time. So by the time you buy it, pay your stamp duty potentially, or depending on, you know, your price point, and if you're a first home buyer, you may not pay much. But, you know, you're conveyancing, your building and pest inspections, and then if you have to sell down the track, you've always got selling fees and marketing costs and so forth. So transacting in property is expensive. So really have a think about the time frames in which you want that property to serve you. Like I said, is it your first home? Is it a couple home? Is it a family home? And then proceed on that basis. The other thing I encourage is have a really clear buying or auction bidding strategy. And most people think that you just rock up to an auction and you stick your hand up. It's actually more complex than that. You know, you really do want an idea of who your competition is. You want an idea of how you're going to start bidding. You need to know what pace you're going to continue through the auction bidding process. You need to have a strategy in place for what happens if the property passes in. You know, what does that mean? How are you going to handle that? How will you represent yourself in that negotiation? Do you know what can happen when the property passes in, and do you know how you can actually trip yourself up if you don't know what you're doing there? So you've got to remember, when you're dealing with selling agents, these agents have got enormous amounts of training, and they're highly sophisticated in their tactics to try and extract as much money from you as possible. And most people don't know what they don't know when it comes to the negotiation or the bidding or the buying process. And with anything, you know, in life, and particularly in real estate, it's never what you know that brings you undone. Often it's what you don't know. And again, most people don't know what they don't know. So just be really well informed about how to go about it. Certainly if it's putting in an offer on a private sale, you can talk to your conveyancer about the best way of doing that, but that's very different to knowing how to negotiate price and knowing what to pay. You know, filling in a contract is easy, you know, your conveyancer can help, but price strategy and bidding strategy is different. The other thing is ensure you know your property values and you're pricing the property correctly to buy. And I spoke about that before. There are 3 different prices to consider. There's often the price you want to pay, which is an emotional way of thinking. There's what the property's worth in the marketplace, and you can determine that through appraising it and looking at comparable recent sales evidence. And there's also what's the emotional price that you're prepared to pay or other buyers might be prepared to pay. And that gives you a gauge of where or how much more you need to go over, say, the property appraised price to be able to secure it. So understand it's a complex process. You might need some help with it, but this is where I find that you don't get a prize for coming second in an auction. And it's always a fine balance between you don't want to overpay, but you don't want to continually miss out as well. And so understanding where value lies is really important. So on that note, if you're struggling with that, you can seek help from an independent licensed buyer's agent before you buy property, and especially if you need help at any stage or you keep missing out. So it may be that you've found the property and you just need someone to help you assess it and then negotiate or bid for you, or it may be that you've found it and you've assessed it and you know what you're prepared to pay up to, but you just want someone to do the bidding or put the offer in for you. So buyer agents offer different services, service levels, and they have different fees for those service levels. Often they're a fixed fee, some may or may not charge a percentage, but I encourage you to find a buyer's agent in the marketplace, and REBA, which is the Real Estate Buyers Agents Association, depending on the state you live in, has got a lot of members who work to a particular code of conduct. And so at a minimum, you want to make sure that they are a genuine buyer's agent, they're genuinely independent, they are licensed as a real estate agent to transact on your behalf, and you want to make sure that they legitimately work for you, the buyer, because you'll be paying them in that process and they won't receive any income from any other third party. So there are lots of little operators out there using that term buyer's agent in a misleading manner, so just be really careful about that. And things to also take into consideration, you know, the first property you buy is often the stepping stone for your life, so it's really important to get it right. I know first home buyers that I've worked with often think that they can't afford to work with me because they see dollars that they're paying, but the reality is more often than not, they can't afford not to work with me as a buyer's agent, because the reality is if they get it wrong, it will impact their financial future for the rest of their life. So if you want assistance and you need to buy an investment grade property and you want something that's going to grow in value substantially and build that equity and give you that capital growth that you can leverage from and upgrade down the track, it's imperative that you get the right advice from qualified people to help you with that. And also, time wasted searching and missing out in a competitive or a rising market is actually costing you money. You know, I've spoken to people where certainly last year, the year before, they were looking for 6 months trying to find a property to buy, and in that time the market had increased by $100,000 and they still didn't have an outcome. Now that's way more than what you'd pay a buyer agent to basically do the work for you, make sure it's an investment grade property, do the negotiation and actually secure you an outcome and a result. So just understand that people will always pay a price, but it may be more a price in terms of a compromised property, compromised capital growth, not getting into the market, having to change your brief, having to change suburb, having to change property type, because the time that it's taken you to get the outcome or the continual missing out effectively, you know, has cost you. Yeah, so just take that into consideration. So, Terry, time for questions. If you've got any questions that you'd like to share.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Miriam. Thanks for your presentation so far. And I just alert people out there watching and listening that if you do have questions, you can type your questions into the Q&A panel that you should see in front of you on your screen, and that will pop up in front of me, and I can put those questions to Miriam. There is a question, Miriam, about the references you made a number of times to what you termed as investment grade properties. What do you actually mean by that?
So I mean the properties that have got criteria and fundamentals that have really strong owner-occupier appeal, and they're properties that will outperform the market. So it just basically means year on year on year, if the market's delivering, say, a 10% return or an 8% return, these might be properties that year on year deliver an 11 or a 12 or a 13% return. Not all properties are investment grade, probably only 5% of the market are. You know, there is a skill set involved in ascertaining what's investment grade. I mean, I know when I analyse and assess a property, we have a criteria checklist of 57 items that we go through, and we analyse it on that basis, and it has to achieve a certain rating to qualify. So yeah, just be aware of that. And things that make up whether or not a property is investment grade include, you know, what suburb you're buying in, what part of the suburb you're buying in, what's the property type that you're buying, is it in high demand and low supply, does it have strong emotional or owner-occupier appeal, who's likely to be your tenant, are you easily and readily going to be able to put a tenant in there. So a whole lot of things come into consideration to determine whether or not a property is investment grade.
Okay, and another question which is probably related, you referred a number of times to properties being compromised. What are the sort of things in your experience that compromise a property?
Yeah, so basically it's the opposite of what's investment grade. So things like buying on a main or a busy road, that can make it very difficult to resell the property down the track. So it's one thing having a compromised property and selling it in a hot market. You know, there tends to be a greater chance of selling if it's priced to sell. But when you're in a flat market or a down market or a dropping market, any kind of property that's compromised will just simply mean it's going to be harder for you to shift as and when you need it to. So if you're too close to a rail line, if you're too close to or on a busy or a main road, if there's any sort of congestion, sometimes being, you know, if you've got a street that's a T section, your property is the one at the bottom of that T, and you get the lights constantly shining in your window at night time, that's a compromised location. It could be the property itself. It could be that you've got one really good bedroom and two tiny bedrooms, and you're going to struggle to rent it, or you're going to struggle to, you know, have a family in that house because the bedrooms are too small. It might be the floor plan's not a really good flowing floor plan or a practical functional floor plan. That would be a compromise potentially in a property. So anything that could potentially mean that a future buyer may not want to buy it from you, you know, as I said, the obvious things, too close to rail lines and main roads, or it could just be an emotional thing. It could be that property's south-facing, that it doesn't get enough light, and it's too cold. So, yeah, so many different things to consider. It could be if you're buying in a group of villas or a little group of villas, it could be that there are too many villas in the development and you need to buy in a smaller development. So it'll come down to the property itself, it'll come down to the block or the land it's on, it'll come down to the group that it's in and the size of the group, suburb, it'll come down to capital growth in the area. There's a lot of things to take into consideration.
Okay, one of our listeners and watchers asked the question, I see a lot of retirement living apartments advertised as investment properties. Is it worth investing in them, or are they more hassle than gain?
Well, it's interesting. Generally, retirement living, you have to be over the age of 55 to be able to buy. Frequently, you're buying a license to occupy a property, not actually buying the title to a property. I don't know how they would structure it from an investment point of view. You really want to look at the paperwork very carefully, because if you're looking to borrow money to buy, I don't know how a bank would necessarily receive the titling or the lack of titling around it. So do some investigations around that. And the other thing you have to remember, what constitutes a good investment? Is it the yield that you're looking at getting? Is it capital growth? Is it the ease at which you want to get out of that asset down the track and sell? So it'll depend, whether or not it's a good asset will depend on your personal circumstances. It'll depend on your personal risk profile. It'll depend on your strategy. You know, is it a cash flow strategy or is it a capital growth strategy? I'd suggest if it's capital growth, it may not be the best type of property to invest in. Same as short stay apartments and accommodation, that sort of thing. They may not also be a particularly good investment because they're hard to borrow money on and they're hard to resell down the track when you want to.
Okay, thank you. Another question, and this is very, very broad in general, and perhaps you could actually speak to the nature of the question as well as the content of it, but the question is it a good idea to invest in a city or fringe suburbs?
That's a really broad question.
Yeah.
Look, again, it comes down to supply and demand. And again, ultimately, what's your strategy? You know, are you looking to invest for cash flow? Are you looking to invest for capital growth? Are you looking for a balance of both? So location is one part of the consideration. Property type is another. Supply and demand factors are another. Growth drivers are another consideration, and there are multiple growth drivers. So what's the population growth like? What's the infrastructure development like? What are the employment opportunities like? So whether you buy closer to the city or on a city fringe, really you have to look at the fundamentals of what's going to drive growth and drive income and enable you to attract the right tenant and sell it down the track readily when you want to for a decent amount of money. So it's a complex process to ascertain the best place to buy. And, you know, Terry, you do some fantastic hot spotting reports and we've done seminars in the past around what to look for when you're determining whether or not to buy in an area. But it's important to be careful not just to look at one growth driver. You know, there are plenty of suburbs in recent times from an affordability point of view that have had substantial population growth because affordability is what's driving the growth. But it doesn't mean you've got infrastructure, and it doesn't mean you've got employment opportunities, and it doesn't mean you've got long-term, medium to long-term demand. And in some of those suburbs, you might find that you've got a continual supply of land that's to be released into the future, which will affect capital growth. So, yeah, it's complicated.
It is complicated, and I think the nature of the question, I think it's indicative for a lot of people. Have a very simplistic or generalised view of markets. Now, is the inner city better than the middle ring or the outer ring suburbs? And it's really just not as simple as that. It really comes down to all those different criteria that you've just referred to.
And same with regional. Is it better to buy in a regional area versus a metro area? Well, again, what's your strategy? Are you after capital growth? Do you want to diversify your portfolio? Are you already heavily weighted in regional and you want to diversify and have some metro? Have you got only capital growth properties that are negatively geared and now you need some positively geared cash flow properties? So there's no one size fits all. And I think this is where the dumbing down of the whole process has come in over the decades from, again, property spruikers and developers and some real estate agents, because they make it sound simple because they want you to buy the property inevitably that they want to sell you, whether it's right for you or not. So this oversimplification of investing and these myths that are running around in the marketplace, like such as, you know, all property doubles in 7 years, they are in the marketplace and put out by those people who will give you free information or biased information because they want to sell the stock they've got on hand to sell you. And again, it's complex. You know, you're investing hundreds of thousands of dollars, potentially even millions of dollars. This isn't a quick, fast decision that you make based on the minimum amount of information and then assuming you'll make $1 million. It just doesn't work that way. There's very high risk associated with buying property, because it's actually easier to get it wrong than it is to get it right. And again, it's not what you know, it's what you don't know. And even for people who attend seminars, I've sat down with people and they've gone through and they've explained their strategy and their concept and they couldn't figure out why it didn't work. And it's only because there was this one thing that they didn't take into consideration, but that one thing is where their whole portfolio has collapsed because they weren't aware that that's something that they should have been aware of. So just be really, really careful when you're out there. Just take, free advice is usually never good advice. It's usually always biased, and more often than not, it's sales advice. And that person on the other end of the transaction, if they've got stock and property to sell you, they don't work for you. They don't look after your best interests. They're there to get an outcome. They're there to sell stock for their vendor. They'll get paid a commission or an income when they do. They're really, for all intents and purposes, not your friend, because they don't work for you and they don't have your best interests. So there's a reason that we use the term buyer beware. And there's also a reason why you say a fool and their money are easily parted, because it's a little bit like, if you've got a brain tumour, you don't take a Panadol and hope that it's going to go away. You see a surgeon and an expert and you get them to help you, cut it out, treat it, whatever the case may be. Again, property investing isn't something that we've all gone to school and learnt about growing up, and often we may or may not have parents who are experienced or particularly good at it. We kind of get information from friends around the barbecue. You've got to be really careful where you get your information from, and who you're talking to, and what expertise and experience they bring to the table. Just because someone's done it once doesn't make them the expert, and just because they think they've done okay doesn't mean they actually have, because they may not know where they've shot themselves in the foot and how much money they've actually missed out on. And often people don't find that out until it's 10 or 20 or 30 years down the track, and it's too late and they don't know why it went wrong in the first place. So yeah, just to appreciate the fact that it is complicated. I wrote my best-selling book, Property Prosperity, for the purpose of educating people. The first, I think you can download some chapters for free if you go on to Miriam Sandkuhler.com, propertyprosperity.com.au. You can download the first three chapters for free. And in the first 40 pages, it's all about smoke and mirrors and how you get lied to and how you get ripped off and how you make mistakes and who to be wary of. So please just, go and download that, or, you can buy the book on Kindle for $3.99, on amazon.com.au. So, spend that $4, it's less than a cup of coffee, and there's enough information there to at least protect you from making poor decisions. I wrote it because I want people to make good decisions and profitable decisions and smart decisions.
So we have some questions about you and your services. Harry's asking, is there a specific area that you specialise in? And I assume he means geographical areas.
Well, I work in all of Melbourne Metro, and I work regionally as well in Victoria. I do have counterparts who work interstate, so if someone is looking to buy in states other than Victoria, I can definitely refer you to some good operators interstate as well. So, yeah.
And there are specific opportunities. We certainly see it in hotspotting at the moment in regional Victoria, some of the strongest markets in the state right now. Interested to hear what you're finding in your work, but we're certainly finding markets like Ballarat very, very strong, getting a lot of buyer interest out of Melbourne, and Bendigo is starting to get on board with that as well.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I've been fortunate in that I've been buying in Ballarat for the last 5 years, and Geelong a little bit more recently, and those markets are incredibly hot at the moment. We have a lot of locals. One of the reasons why Geelong's going particularly well is Geelong's the gateway to the surf coast, but it's also close enough to Melbourne to be able to commute. Ballarat, similar, close enough to Melbourne to be able to commute. So people are finding that instead of, say, buying 20 kilometres out of Melbourne and sitting in traffic for 2 hours to get to work every day in the morning and then another 2 hours to get home, they can take that budget and they can go somewhere like a Ballarat or a Geelong. They can get better bang for buck. They've got better access to amenity and infrastructure and hospitals and schools and even employment. And those that do commute to Melbourne, they're sitting on a V-line train for an hour and a quarter each way, playing on their iPad, reading a book, or doing some work on their laptop. So it's a much more pleasant, appealing and affordable lifestyle for a lot of people that don't want the metro crush anymore, and they're going to those areas as a result.
And a lot of these areas also have very strong economies in their own right. They're creating jobs, so people don't just move there and commute back to jobs in Melbourne. They actually, many people are actually finding good employment in cities like Geelong, Ballarat,
absolutely,
which have very, very strong local economies and are creating jobs in their own right.
Absolutely. And look, I've been buying for investors and home buyers in Ballarat for a number of years. You know, most recently I bought for 2 properties for 2 different GPs who are there, you know, doing their 12-month internship, and they're going to hold on to those properties as investment properties after they leave. So, you know, it's there are enormous opportunities from an employment perspective, and those economies are performing really, really well. And again, people are finally cottoning on to it. One of the biggest challenges I see constantly, though, that you have to be very careful of, when I buy in Ballarat and I do a price comparable, I'm always comparing Ballarat with Ballarat. We've had a lot of Melbourne and metro and interstate buyers going into the Ballarat market, and unfortunately they compare Ballarat prices to Melbourne metro or Sydney metro, and they consequently frequently overpay because they're doing the wrong comparable. So you just have to be careful if you're going into a regional area. Yes, prices are less than what you're paying in metro centre, but that doesn't mean you should be paying 10 or 20% more because you think it's cheap. So you have to be really careful buying into a regional area, because you've got to know the regional market, you've got to know the neighbouring suburbs, you've got to know the property type, and the demand and supply considerations, proximity to the, you know, again, train lines, employment, infrastructure, etc. And all of that will come into ascertaining the price you should pay for a property. So I'm seeing a lot of overpaying at the moment because, again, people don't know the market.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a trap for people coming out of a place like Melbourne and becoming very enthusiastic about the relative affordability of a place like Ballarat and paying too much. Tracy, asking a question, I assume as a potential first-time buyers, how long does it take to apply for the first-time buyers grant, and should you organise this before you start searching for property?
Well, the conveyancer will help you with that, and I think lenders or mortgage brokers can give you guidance around that as well. So that's part of your loan application process and your conveyancing process. So again, I'd get your loan application underway straight away, and in talking with your broker, just explain that you need to apply for that. And when you engage your conveyancer, just making them aware of that as well. So do all of that at the same time.
Okay.
Terry, if I can just go back on the Ballarat thing.
Yeah.
With the overpaying, what I've seen, I had an example last year where I was put an offer in on a property, and again a Melbourne buyer came in and overpaid. I'm seeing a lot of people panic and they're putting offers in properties and they're not making it subject to finance, or they're not doing contract reviews, or they're not doing building and pest inspections, and on top of that they're overpaying. And it's interesting, that particular property that I missed out on in that suburb, I actually had the agent come back to me a few months later saying that the family had realised that it didn't actually meet their needs. It was too small for them. They had teenagers. There was no independent room for them to sort of be separate from each other. And they actually had to put the property back on the market. And that was within less than 6 months of them owning it. So again, if you're a home buyer going into a regional area and you don't know much about that area, again, it's really important to speak with, say, a buyer's agent such as myself who works in that area, so we can give you guidance around what you need to be aware of and things you need to be considered, because these markets are moving so fast now. If you don't know how to work in that market, or you don't have access to off-market properties like we do, or you don't know how to price it, then you can easily make mistakes buying regionally as well, in spite of the fact that properties are cheaper.
Okay. Miriam, time is marching on. I thought I might just end with one question that's still sitting in front of me from Ron, which is a question specifically about your services and what they cost. I thought that might be a good lead into what you want to end it, which is, I think, a special offer to people watching and listening today. Ron's asking, what are your fees for the full service you provide to a first home buyer? Yeah,
well, the fees are really dependent upon the level of service that somebody needs. They are fixed, but it will vary according to how much help that you're wanting. And it is set, and basically the fee's set, but it's set according to price brackets. So I actually won't go into it now because it's not that simple. But what I will offer is 2 things. I'm just going to offer everyone access to free resources at the moment. So if you go onto my website and under the free resources tab, click on that. You can find the free property buyer's guides, and you can download those without having to share your address or email or anything like that. So particularly if you've got first home buyers out there, the 7 common mistakes home buyers make and how to avoid them, download that. If we've got any rentvestors out there, there's an investment one as well. And if anyone's buying in super funds, you can have a look at that too. From a first home buyer view, you know, again, the mistakes are not thinking ahead and planning in advance and knowing how long you need that property to serve you. Trusting the selling agent's often a big mistake. Not having a buying plan, not engaging the right experts at the right time, not doing sufficient research, not understanding negotiation, and being emotional. These are all mistakes that first home buyers make. So feel free to download that. It's about a 20 page little document. So that'll definitely be able to give you some tips in there to help you sort of minimise some mistakes and give you some good things to think about. Certainly if there are any first home buyers, one thing I'll say as well, sorry, just going back to this resources section, my best-selling book is there as well. So as I said, if you click on that link, there is a little link that will take you through to amazon.com.au. It's $3.99 to download it off Kindle. And there are tips in there that will help first home buyers as well, because I talk about negotiation, I talk about what happens at an auction and what happens when a property passes in, and I talk about research and things like that. So that's really good information for home buyers in there as well. If anybody does want help, well, certainly what we do, we work with investors and home buyers buying that investment grade property, whether it's your own home or an investment. And so we help you make sure you're not buying compromised properties. We're looking for those properties that will perform well into the future. So if you're a first home buyer and you're struggling to find the right house or apartment or villa in your budget and you want some access to off-market properties, we can assist you. If you're busy and you're working and you just don't have time to get assistance, we can help you there, and you don't want to waste months finding the right property. If you're an investor or a rentvestor and you need the right strategy and you don't know if it should be capital growth, cash flow, or what's investment grade, we can help you there. So feel free, and to the person that asked the question, again, if you go onto my website under contact, just fill in your details, request a free consultation. We just start with a little 10 or 15 minute phone call to see if there's the ability for me to assist you. And if you're happy with that, we can just tee up a free consultation or a Zoom meeting or something. I can take you through everything in detail, because it's never about it's understanding I suppose the value delivery of what we bring to the table. Things can cost whatever they cost, but if there's no value in it, well, then you've got to think twice about whether or not you engage someone's services. But if you are going to interview any buyer agents, you do really want to ask them what value they deliver and bring to the table, and you want to ask for evidence and proof of their results. You know, you want them to show you years and years worth of results and outcomes. So that's certainly something I'm happy to do. And my direct contact details, if anyone wants to email me directly or jump on the website or give us a call, my information's up there as well.
Okay, great. Miriam, thank you for that. We're almost perfect timing, because we're coming up almost exactly 1 hour since we started, and we do like to keep these webinars to 1 hour, because we're mindful that many people are attending in a lunch break and probably need to get back to your place of employment. So thank you again for an incredibly informative presentation. There's a lot of information there I think people can take away and use. And we started out with the revelation, which I thought was very insightful, that the real estate industry educates people to buy the properties that they want to sell rather than the properties that are in the best interests of the buyers. And I think that's where the services of a buyer's agent are so critical for people, whatever type of buyer they happen to be. I also thought it was insightful, the comment you make, that most people don't know what they don't know. And I think for too many people, they find out what they don't know when it's too late. And it's important, I think, in all sorts of ways. It's so important to have a great team on your side, that you're not out there as a property buyer, whether you're a home buyer or an investor, doing it alone. You need to have people who are expert in all sorts of different fields, whether it be mortgage brokers, accountants, buyers agents, people of all sorts who are specialists, who have your best interests at heart before you sign on the dotted line. Because, as you said very aptly, most people don't know what they don't know. A lot of other revelations and important pieces of information for property buyers, and they're the difference between sales advice and real advice, the new lending landscape and how it's harder to qualify and the importance of getting pre-approvals. I think that was extremely good advice to give to people who are starting out as first-time buyers in particular. So that and a whole lot more in today's presentation. As always, really informative, great value for money. For anybody who wants to follow up, to ask questions of Miriam or to perhaps avail themselves of the services she provide, the contact details on the screen there. I'm sure, Miriam, you'll welcome people to follow up, to phone or to send emails if they have questions.
Absolutely, and as I said, if you're interstate and you want to engage a buyer's advocate interstate, I know some really good operators, so I'm happy to refer you there as well. Okay,
almost exactly 1 hour has passed, so our time is up. Thank you again, Miriam, for a great presentation. This is Terry Ryder from hotspotting.com.au signing off. We will do this again really soon, I hope, Miriam.
Fantastic. Thanks, Terry. Always a pleasure to help out.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.